This is episode 356 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here, have a hand in the making of our show, and access special insider extras. Learn more at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life, and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Dr. Robin Bates, Chair of English at University of Lynchburg. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
A regular dairy building has very, very thick walls so that inside it's quite cold. You might take it underground where actually, even in the summer months, it's not quite as cold as a refrigerator, but it's not bad.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's Two Gentlemen of Verona, Proteus says, "Here's too small a pasture for such a store of muttons." Proteus is speaking metaphorically here, but the phrase refers to the relationship between animals raised in a field that are then processed for food that needs to be stored away in a cache that can be drawn upon for consuming after the processing happens. Well, later, Stephano talks about this idea of food storage in the Tempest. He shares the location of his store of wine, saying, "The whole butt, man. My cellar is in the rock by the seaside where my wine is hid." Now, again, there's a whole story here that's not necessarily about wine in the cellar, but the phrasing here indicates that a cellar was one place to store bottles of wine long-term in Shakespeare's lifetime. Both of these references demonstrate for us that 16th and 17th century society was very familiar with the idea of taking fresh food and processing it into something that could be stored long-term or even over the winter months when fresh food wasn't accessible. But it leaves us with the question of exactly what was a store of muttons, for example. How do you process a sheep and keep it from going bad? Shakespeare and his contemporaries didn't have refrigeration, so what were the methods used to keep fresh meat from going bad? Back with us again this week to help us understand Tudor and Renaissance England's food preservation methods, as well as the storage options for what you did after you had preserved it. We're pleased to welcome our guest and food historian, Neil Buttery. Neil Buttery is a food historian, chef, author, blogger, podcaster, and scientist who is an expert in historical and traditional British food. He's the host of the podcast, British Food History Podcast, as well as author of the book Need to Know, A History of Baking and the Philosophy of Pudding. Neil stays busy writing about, studying, and of course, eating historical food recipes for his books and his website. Neil is a return guest to That Shakespeare Life, having visited with us before to talk about both medlars and sweetbreads. Both episodes will be linked in the show notes for today if you'd like to check out our other conversations with Neil about, of course, food history. Before we dive into our conversation today, I want to let you know that there's coordinating bonus history content about food preservation, including copies of the 16th and 17th century recipes we've mentioned today, along with images of some of those beehive ovens used for drying herbs, as well as the alcove above the chimney that would have been used for smoking meat. We have a lot of period images, paintings, and primary documents packed into the show notes for today. If you'd like to look at the history we're talking about, navigate to our show notes for today at cassidycash.com/EP356 and click on that Patreon button to sign up and access all the extras, and you can peruse the history while you're listening today. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Neil. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life. So glad to have you back here with us again.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be back.
Without refrigeration, I would think that cow's milk was hard. I mean, to me, it seems like a product that might even be impossible to preserve without being able to keep it cold. So for the 16th and 17th century, I know I've seen recipes that use cow's milk prolifically, but was that something that you'd have to go and get it fresh if you were going to use it? Or was there a way to preserve milk in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, it's a complex answer, really. Well, first of all, Yes, you've got to keep it fresh. There's lots of examples of recipes that ask for specifically sweet milk, which means not milk that's had sugar mixed into it, but it means very fresh. So that indicates, therefore, that sometimes milk wasn't. If it's specifically indicated, you wouldn't say that in a recipe today. We'd all assume the milk we were talking about was fresh and, in inverted commas, sweet. So people were, I would say, much more used to the sort of spectrum of flavors you get from fresh milk over several days as they begin to sour by the lactobacteria that are present in there. Now, what was quite common was people would boil milk. They didn't know that there was lots of bacteria and things in there potentially spoiling it. But what they did know was that, especially if they weren't doing the milking themselves, not everyone's clean. People are eating raw milk. There's no pasteurization at this point. So really, what people did just to make sure that things were going to be okay, they'd boil it and sterilize it, which will give you a few more days.
They didn't realize they were sterilizing it. They just knew there was association between getting it hot and it lasting longer.
Yeah, exactly. So that's number one. There's also the fact that cow's milk, anyway, naturally separates out into a layer of cream, which you can skim off. So cream, with it being higher in fat, takes longer to go bad. If you just leave your milk to sour, you begin to, well, it depends where your arbitrary line is, Cassidy. At some point, it's going to start becoming cheese. And I guess that's different depending what country you're from. At what point your milk becomes cheese. But I think that if you're somebody who likes to look at old cookbooks and you try to have a go at maybe making some of the recipes, the devil's in the detail with this kind of thing. And the more you know about the ingredient, the better, and how it was used and how it was consumed. And one really good piece of advice I got from the amazing food historian and food writer Jane Grigson was, if you're making anything from, say, the early modern period up into the Victorian period, really, is to take your milk or your cream and add just a small proportion of soured cream to it, because that more likely actually reflects the real taste, the real flavor of the dairy that the people were using in their recipes.
Because they probably were leaving it for a couple of days. So unless there was something visible or, an extreme malodor to it, they probably were thinking, well, it's okay for a couple of days just to sit there. But you're talking about, would it have been covered as far as when they milk it and then they let it sit there? Is there a container that it's like sitting next to the fire, or where do they put it?
Well, they keep it somewhere cool, so in the dairy. So it would depend. A regular dairy building has very, very thick walls so that inside it's quite cold. You might take it underground, where actually even in the summer months, it's not quite as cold as a refrigerator, but it's not bad. You want to keep it cool to stop the bacteria growing. And you also want to keep it cool and still so you can get the separation of the cream. So you can turn that into, you can use it as cream to have with your strawberries or whatever, or you can take it off and turn that into other products.
So we were talking about cow's milk here and how it separates, and the cream floats up to the top. But was cow's milk the most common? Would other animals like sheep or goats have been milked as well?
Absolutely. And when you're getting into the north of England and Scotland and in Ireland, where there's much higher ground and it's cooler, sheep are much happier in those conditions. So what you'd find is that lots of rural northern communities would be essentially eating and consuming sheep milk and milk products in the main.
Would anyone have used things like nut milks? I think of almond milk, and oat milk is really popular here in my house, but would that have been something that would have existed for Shakespeare's lifetime? Are there any recipes that use nut milks?
Well, there are recipes that use almond milk, which there was huge amounts of it consumed during the Middle Ages, because most days it seemed to be fast days. So you got all of Advent, all of Lent, Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, days where you can't eat meat. You can eat fish products and things like that, but no meat or meat products, animal products. So milk is off the menu. So there's a lot of almond milk, but it was very expensive. You had to be fairly well off. Certainly during the period of the sort of high chivalric periods of Edwards 1, 2, and 3, they were consuming huge amounts of almond to be made into almond milk. Now, that was on its way out during Shakespeare's time. People were a bit, what can you say, a bit lax when it came to fasting and Lent and things like that. They really didn't care too much, but you did see it around a little bit. The other one, and this is quite niche, it's not a nut milk, but it is a plant milk, and that's oat milk, which is, I think, the best of all the plant milks, personally.
I'll have to agree with you there. Yes.
Yeah, it's the best one. It's got the most body to it, I think. It's best replacement for proper milk. Now, that was consumed mainly in Scotland, but also in Northern England, also in Northern Wales, and some places in Ireland as well. So it's very much, again, a northern food because oats grow so much better in cooler, wetter climates compared to the south. Yes, and it was usually fermented. It's called suans, and it's pretty much a forgotten food now. But that was one that I found that I thought was quite interesting.
Is it made the same way as we made it today? It's just oats and water ground up and filtered, or did they do something specific to make it suans by definition?
It was very much a famine food. So what would happen is if you got your oats, you would take them off to be ground by the miller. Oats have this very loose outside covering, and they get those removed. I think they're chilled. I think the verb is you chill them off. Basically an outer husk. It's not the bran. The bran's left on them. And it was this husk that people would receive returned from the miller along with their meal to make into porridge or whatever. All these, well, what look like, and I've tried to make this as well. I have managed to get a hold of some oat husks. You're just thinking, this looks like something a rabbit would use as a mattress. It doesn't look like anything's edible. You can see a little bit of dust or what have you. But what people would do is they would get a big bowl of water called a bowie and immerse these husks. And what you see is all the little bits of starch that remained stuck on the inside of the husks would float down to the bottom like a snow globe. And they would pour the water off, get rid of the husks, and they'd take that little layer, and it had gone sour by now, and they'd use that to make into a kind of porridge. Very good for the elderly and the sick, apparently. It was used right up into the 19th century in hospitals in Scotland. So, people used to really swear by it, and it's pretty much a dead food now.
So once really relied upon and now almost completely gone.
Yep.
What about milk products? You talked about you mentioned just barely cheese a little bit earlier, but I want to ask about cheese and butter. Are these methods for preserving milk, or are they entirely separate foods? I mean, butter can presumably be made at the time you want to eat it, but cheese specifically would have to ferment. And I know today there's lots of preservation methods for cheese, including covering the giant cheese wheel in wax, I think is a quintessential image for cheese. Did this exist for Shakespeare's lifetime, or what did cheese preservation look like in the 16th and 17th century?
Well, cheese is very important. Well, butter too, because first of all, yes, they do preserve the milk. But secondly, it makes the milk portable. It's very difficult, sloshing about a load of milk.
I would think so, yes.
Maybe it's hot. You've got them in containers. They're going to go off very quickly. It's much better if you've got something you can actually just pick up, put on the back of a horse and cart, and off you go. So as well as it being a way of preserving, it also had a sort of logistical reason for existing too. And it's also delicious, of course.
Always helpful, yes.
Yeah.
Would they have wrapped cheese wheels in wax, like beeswax? Would they have dipped it in that to have it a longer shelf life?
I don't think so. I couldn't find any examples. I've never found any examples where that's the case. They're usually covered in things like cheesecloth. Sometimes nettle leaves is an example. Wild garlic leaves, things like that.
So many of the things that you would use to keep, bugs out of a garden, anything with that, strong fragrance to keep the bad things away would be useful for wrapping up cheese and trying to protect it from anything that might try to attack your cheese when it's in storage.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Drying food was a popular method for preserving food in Shakespeare's lifetime. But what kinds of food were most often preserved by drying? And walk us through the methods for drying food in this period.
Well, drying was used in the main, I would say, for fish. White fish, so things like cod, haddock, ling, hake, those sorts of things. And they were very much, it was extremely straightforward. I'm assuming you had to be really good at predicting the weather because essentially you would get the fish, gut them, take the heads off, skin them sometimes, and lay them on the beach just to dry, hung up on bits of string. And they would then get extremely dry. And then again, they can be kept and also moved around the country. So often eaten by poor people during Lent, because that was really the only fish that they could afford, because having fresh fish during Lent, fish goes off very, very quickly. Unless you've gone out and caught it yourself and you're allowed to catch it yourself in the common grounds, the chances are of getting fresh fish are very small. So that was the main one. Apparently, in the main ports, places like Portsmouth on the south coast of England did a lot of that, certainly around Scotland as well. And the smell was atrocious, apparently. Yes, if you went down to
I can imagine. You've got a whole beach full of dead fish.
Yes, indeed. And I'm sure they weren't always good at judging the weather. So I'm sure sometimes things went a little awry for them. So yes, fish are the main ones. There are things like herbs and flowers and things like that, which were used to flavour foods, but also used medicinally. They were often put in the oven, the bread oven, those beehive ovens. So once they've made their bread and maybe made some pastries and things like that, just the residual heat, is maybe just above room temperature. They would strew, as they would say, their herbs on the floor of the oven, and then the next morning or the next day or whatever, they'd have some nice, perfectly dry herbs.
Gardening was obviously a great way to grow crops like grains and root vegetables. But what happened once the weather was too cold to grow food? Were there methods of preserving vegetables?
Well, yes, and there were methods that we would really recognize today. Foods that are sweet and savory, today anyway, most of us like to kind of keep the sweet and savory foods separate, whereas in the early modern period, it was all kind of a bit of a melange and all mixed together. So you find quite a few vegetables are preserved in sugar syrups and things like that, like a jam or a jelly or a marmalade. They were also pickled in vinegar or in brine. I cannot, and I have been looking a lot over the last couple of years, Cassidy, I cannot find a single example in England, not just Tudor England, but England at all at any point, or even the UK at any point, is anybody making any live fermented preserves, such as sauerkraut.
Like kombucha or something like that.
Yeah, I can't find any examples of similar things to sauerkraut, and I don't know why.
That is surprising. Yes,
you'd think there'd be by its absence,
some version of it for it to be completely missing.
It's always very strange.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we have a research project there to chase that down.
We do.
What kind of jars or containers were used to preserve these stored goods? So once we had our plethora of dried herbs, or we had our set of dried fish, assuming the weather was with us and we got what we wanted there, what do we do with them? Where do we put these? How do we seal them? Because I mean, even dried herbs are susceptible to bugs and things. Are they protecting from that kind of thing?
Well, often they're hung from the rafters of the home, close to the chimney, so where it's just much more airy and there's a bit of smoke around that maybe might keep off the flies when it comes to dried herbs and flowers and things like that. There are pottles, which are essentially earthenware jars that on the inside have been glazed, because when you're using earthenware, you've got to glaze it because it's slightly porous. So if you do pour in your pickle and things like that, it's just going to end up sort of absorbing into the pot itself, and also bacteria can come in, from the other end, the other side, from the outside. So that would be used, and then it would be covered typically with what seems to be most common anyway, is some boiled leather. So it's nice and pliable, and then you can put that over, straight, so it's sterilized straight from the hot water, and tie it with a piece of string or a strip of leather, something like that. Later on, people started using bladders. And I was hoping to find an example of a Tudor preserve that was kept or covered by using a bladder, but I couldn't find one, unfortunately.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, where did you learn about them using the bladders? Is this a recipe that says, please take your cow bladder and stretch it over the jar? Or where do we find out that that's what they were using?
Well, this is the thing. Things are not always mentioned. So when you're looking in old cookbooks or household books from the early modern period, they don't tell you a lot of stuff. And you don't know whether that's because they didn't do it,
or because it was ubiquitous and everybody knew it already.
Yeah. Why am I telling you how to cover over a pot to preserve it? Everybody knows that. I'm not, what we're interested in is what's my recipe for what's inside. I'm going to assume you know how to do the rest. So it's quite difficult sometimes really pinning down some of these recipes and what was happening. So maybe bladders were being used. It's not until the 18th century that you see bladders being mentioned. But that doesn't necessarily mean
they weren't.
Used.
Yeah,
it's just nobody talked about it. And once you get out of the sort of Tudors and Stuarts and into the Georgians, that's when you get cookery books for the first time, giving you lots of detail about what to do.
It would make sense that, the 18th century had to learn this from somewhere. They weren't creating this as an advent, I would think. So I'm with you as far as a working theory that probably there were methods for sealing the jars that the Tudor cookery books just don't mention because it was such an assumption.
It's difficult to find information on this kind of stuff. It would make an excellent PhD for somebody.
There you go. Well, somebody out there now has their topic. Now, slaughtering a cow or a pig, I was looking up images for winter scenes for another episode of our podcast. And in one of them, the picture was named December in Holland. And in the background, you can see a family with just this enormous boar. It's almost bigger than the people in the picture. And obviously there's history to chase down there, but they're in the process of preserving this giant pig for their family. And it made me wonder, how is that done? They didn't have, you mentioned that they had a dairy, so that's a little bit colder, not quite a refrigerator, of course, but you've got some cold storage there happening. But this giant boar and even a cow, that's a massive amount of meat. So when you're slaughtering an animal for what you want to eat, it's way more than a single person can eat in a sitting. So before the meat would go rancid and there weren't freezers to put it in, what did preserving a cow look like for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, you're quite right. You did need to preserve it pretty quickly. So what's usually happening when the animal's slaughtered, what you immediately eat is the offal, the variety meats from inside it. And there's also usually a capable woman ready to catch all the blood to make blood sausages, black puddings, and that kind of thing. So it was highly regimented, the killing of an animal. You had to make sure you caught the blood. You had to make sure you went off and made these sausages with them, because really those are the intestines that are otherwise unrequired, I suppose. So very quickly, going right back to ancient times, blood sausage goes right back to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and maybe even Mesopotamia. So people have been doing this for many centuries. Everything else, unless there's maybe some kind of big feast, if you're doing it on a feasting day, everything else is immediately cured in salt. Usually a dry cure, so a salt rub, essentially, but sometimes with spices. They're quite different to today because we like to add quite a lot of sugar in our mixes, which improves the flavor, of course, but it also tenderizes the meat. And if you do use just salt, you do get something that's quite hard and tough, that requires really long, slow cooking, to get something that's palatable. But the great thing is, you can use it to put up shelves with instead of a hammer. It gets that hard.
I'm going to take my steak and build my house now.
Exactly. But the great thing is you can put it in the rafters. So it might be put inside the chimney. Often there'll be a little alcove inside the chimney breast where you would hang up your meat so it could smoke. Not cook. So the smoke's all going up by the side of it, and it could essentially cold smoke. And then once you take it out of that, you can keep it in the rafters, and then just take bits off, take slices, collops as they called them then, and you'd fry them up with your eggs or whatever. And when it came to Lent, there's Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday, it's Pancake Day in Britain, but there's also Collop Monday, which nobody does anymore. But
we should bring this back, absolutely.
Bring back Collop Monday, but that's when you're using the last of your salt meat ready for, the 40 days of fasting ahead of you. So you would slice up your meat, fry that, maybe have it with eggs. You'd keep the fat, the bacon fat that was all fried in, and then the next day you'd fry your pancakes in the bacon fat.
I think this sounds like a fabulous tradition. I am completely on board for Collop Monday.
Well, indeed.
And now, when you're saying a dry rub, though, they're not just putting a little bit of salt on the outside. I'm assuming this is like a giant barrel full of, like, when you're looking down in it, it looks like it's full of salt, except there's meat in it. Am I correct about that? Or is this like, because you mentioned hanging from the rafters. Explain for us, if we walked into someone's house and they had just preserved a whole bunch of meat, what would we see?
Okay, so yes, it would be things in tubs, in salting tubs, also brining tubs, but that was less common. What you'd essentially have in the larder, the lard in larder, of course, meaning of a pig, something of a pig, you'd have these usually stone troughs with a little hole in it. So that what you would do is you'd get your pieces of meat, cover them in salt and spices, and you'd stack them up essentially, and that draws out the water, and then that will go out of a little hole, like a little drain. Once everything's cured it depends. It depends on your preference. It depends on your climate. But something like 10 to 14 days, you can rinse off the salt, and then you can smoke it if you want, and then hang it up on the rafters. So it takes quite a few weeks for the process to be complete.
So definitely an undertaking. You can understand why they would have like a time of year for this activity, because it was quite involved. And as you mentioned, it involved a lot of people, because you had to have someone handling the sausage, someone handling the intestines, and then someone doing the curing and everything else. So.
Yeah, it's a bit like harvest, where the whole community is required to work and get this done so that everybody makes it through wintertime.
I read that fruit was sometimes preserved in jars of honey. Can you tell us about how that process worked and what other methods there were to preserve fruit for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Again, not that different to today, really, mostly. So yes, they were preserved in honey. It's one of those things where it was more expensive to preserve things in sugar at the time. In the main, in England, we were getting our sugar from Madeira and the Canary Islands, not quite getting loads of it from the New World at this point. It's not really tied to transatlantic slavery at this point. Although there was some of it, but we mainly get it from Madeira. Certainly Henry VIII was eating Madeiran sugar. And people have been preserving all sorts of things, meat, fruit, vegetables in honey for millennia. So that was a tried and tested thing, where really all you're doing is heating up some honey and popping your fruit in. It's as simple as that. You might add a few spices or herbs, but that's essentially it. It's got natural antibiotics in it, as well as being almost 100% sugar. So yeah, it's pretty good. Nothing's going to be going off anytime soon if you're preserving them in honey. And that was quickly modified to be used with sugar. So you have jams and jellies, things called suckets, which were very common, which are, what would we call them today? You buy those, it's really delicious ginger root in syrup, where it's been candied.
Oh yeah, candied ginger. We have that here.
Yeah, that's an example of a sucket. You got dry suckets and wet suckets. Dry suckets were where they were kind of rolled in a bit of sugar and you'd eat it like some candy. And then there were wet suckets where it was in syrup, and you'd be sat in the dessert course, picking out with your special little sucket fork, picking out little bits of ginger to eat. Sucket forks had a fork on one end and a little spoon on the other end, so you could then spoon a little bit of the syrup and eat that. Those who could afford it were eating very, very sweet things. So that's one thing. And of course, there's regular jams and jellies as well, although they weren't called jams and jellies at the time. They were just called sort of conserves. You just need to conserve gooseberries, whatever. We don't get the word jam really until, again, the 18th century, where we get a lot of our modern food words from.
I know we are thrilled to dive into the world of food preservation. I know I'm excited to go find the nearest early modern recipe book I can and look for conserve and suck it and see what I can dream up to make from these, because it sounds really fun to do, especially the suck it fork. I want to find one of those. That's fabulous. But if we're new to this topic, if we don't know about food preservation in Shakespeare's lifetime yet, and we are inspired by your conversation to learn more, tell us where we should start, because, the world's a big place and you are a reliable resource for where we should begin. So give us some suggestions.
Well, I got some really good advice recently from an amazing food historian called Ivan Day. He's probably the best. He's probably regarded as the sort of world's most esteemed food historian. He really knows his stuff. And we were chatting, and he said to me, I learned how to do sort of medieval stuff, Tudor stuff, Georgian food. He cooks from really across history. And one thing that he realized was that people hadn't changed what they were doing for quite a long time. But like I said before, they're not necessarily writing down what to do. But by the time you get into the 18th and 19th century, where people are really having to write detailed methods for making foods, whether it's bread, whether it's jam, whether it's beer, whatever it is. And he realized that the knowledge had just been passed down by generations and generations, but really people weren't really changing. And he's had this confirmed a few times with various fine archaeological finds and things like that. So I'm going a very long-winded way to say, have a look in some 18th and 19th century cookbooks, because things haven't changed that much and they're much more detailed. They tell you what to do and point out pitfalls or give you some hints as to make sure that you're successful. And then, of course, there are absolute scores of those. So I'm going to help narrow it down a little bit. First of all, I think I've mentioned this book before, and it's by Peter Breers, Cooking and Dining in Tudor and Early Stuart England. Loads of recipes. He's worked in museums his entire life, so he's been able to reenact things. He did the kitchens at Hampton Court Palace. So, he's pretty good. And then once you're a bit familiar with that, what I would say is have a look at some contemporary to Shakespeare books. And my number one is this, Eleanor Fettiplace's receipt book. Have you come across?
I have, but I came across it because of you, actually. I went and got a copy of this book because you recommended. And yes, do tell us again why she's so fabulous.
Well, her recipes are great, but specifically, it's the edition edited by Hilary Spurling. If you can get it for not very many pounds online, very easily. It's out of print now, I think. You can buy various facsimiles of Eleanor Fettiplace's book that's just looks like the book, and that's fine. But the great thing about this is she gives you historical context, she talks about the equipment that was used, and she also updates a lot of the recipes for a modern kitchen and uses modern weights and things like that. So really, she's not spoon feeding you, but she's holding your hand.
Which is great. It's nice to have a friend in the kitchen when you're diving into the past and you're like, I'd really like to recreate some of these recipes, but I don't want to die from diseases either.
Well, exactly.
So,
and
yeah,
it's really important, I think, because these are great recipes. They're not historical recipes. They're just recipes that maybe people don't make anymore. They're still really good. So if somebody can help you and point them in the right direction, I wouldn't worry too much about thinking, I can't quite use the exact blackcurrants that they used then, so it's not going to taste the same. Or I've only got an electric hob. They're going to be doing this, over coals or something, so it's not going to taste the same. Just make it. Make it with the equipment you'd have to hand, because that's what people did then too.
Yes.
For food to stay relevant, then we've got to be able to make it in our own kitchen, and you're sometimes going to have to cut some corners or fill in some blanks yourself, but that's okay. That's keeping the food. It's keeping the food alive and relevant.
I agree. I think even with recipes I've had passed down to me from my grandparents or great grandparents, when I make them myself in my kitchen, it's just a little bit different because I don't have her pan or I don't have that kind of flour. So I make it with what I do have. And I think that's yes, I applaud you and I support wholeheartedly. Just dive in and have some fun with historical recipes.
And it would be ridiculous to say, like, there's no one recipe for lasagna.
No.
It would be ridiculous for to say that there would be.
With as many 16th century versions of things, I mean, we talked about wassail the other day on the show, and there's like 47 different ways to make wassail, even if you go back to 16th and century period documents of, well, this person made it with these spices and that person made it with these over here. So there is some comfort to have in the authenticity of making it your own, because that's exactly what they would have done then.
Yes, being authentic, it's a nonsense term, really, because you can't be. But you shouldn't let that stop you at the end of the day.
Well, we will place links to these resources as well as to Neil's work in the show notes for today's episode, so you can try out some of these if you would like, as well as to explore the history of food preservation further. So stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Neil, as you know, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and I will allow you to choose another book for your deserted island choice. My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I would choose a rather obscure book called Lost Country Life by Dorothy Hartley.
That sounds like a wonderful book to dive into.
It's amazing. And she very much focuses on the tail end of the Middle Ages and the early modern period for the setting of her book. She was an amazing woman, Dorothy Hartley. She wrote a very famous book called Food in England, I think in about 1954 or something. And that's the book that most people know. She toured the country interviewing people who were very elderly at the time. And she managed to capture quite a lot of folklore, local knowledge, and things like that. And she managed to distill it down to this book called Food in England, which is great. And I also recommend that one. However, I'm going to say Lost Country Practices because there is such detail in there that you just think, how on earth did she find this kind of stuff out? Well, we do know because she went through families' manuscripts, that she didn't go to libraries to find this stuff out. She was
digging through family letters.
She was going around the country on a bicycle, finding all this stuff out. She was a unique person. She really was. And she managed to capture in her books things that would have been completely lost. So it's an absolutely fantastic book.
What a neat way to visit the past and learn about this history that would have completely disappeared otherwise. I always come away from our conversations with good book recommendations I'm excited to check out. Thank you for these too. So, Neil, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I've recently had a couple of big book projects. They're over now. I'm doing a few talks and things like that about them. Yes.
Take a deep breath.
So I've been doing lots of talks on the history of puddings and the history of baking for my two books. And I'm going to be doing that right up until Christmas. I must admit, I don't think every author can say this, but it's a part of the job that I actually really like. Going out, meeting people and chatting to them. So I'm going to be doing that. And I'm not working on any books at the moment. I think writing two books at the same time.
I think a break there is well earned. Yes.
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 I'm a shadow of my former self, Cassidy.
Well, you've put all of yourself into these books, it sounds like.
But I have got lots of ideas for new ones. But I'm very much focusing on getting some posts for my blog at britishfoodhistory.com and getting some podcast episodes out there myself.
Oh, I'm looking forward to reading those and to hearing those episodes. If you have not already, you should definitely check out the British Food History podcast with Neil Buttery, as well as his website. We'll place links to these in the show notes because Neil goes through not just the recipes, but the backstories behind them, the ingredients and where they come from and how the recipe came to be, as well as walking you through how you can make them. It's a really fun place to hang out if you like food history. So make sure you check out those. Neil Buttery, thank you so much for being here again this week and for just visiting with us on That Shakespeare Life. As ever, it's been fun going through the history of food preservation here with you. And I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy book tour to stop by and share it with us.
Thank you very much.
There's more information about Neil's work, including direct links to his podcast, sample recipes he's provided just for you, as well as links to his books and publications packed into the show notes for today's episode. You can find these at CassidyCash.com/episode 356. While you're there, be sure to check out the links to Neil's latest book, Need to Know, A History of Baking, as well as his publication on the philosophy of pudding. If you follow Neil, you'll learn very quickly that proper puddings and historical ones are a passion of Neil's, so both of these are well worth exploring. The links to these and more on Neil Buttery are in the show notes for today's episode. And again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP356. Don't forget to look for the Patreon button on that page to access the bonus history related to today's conversation. If you love the history you learn about here on the show and you'd like to go one step further and actually try out some of the history we talk about here on the podcast, including making some of these recipes that we mentioned in our show today, then you will love Experience Shakespeare. Experience Shakespeare is our Patreon tier designed to let you try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the 16th and 17th century, all of which you can complete at home or in your classroom with items you may already have at home or can easily source from your local market or store. Each of our hands-on activity kits not only show you step-by-step how to complete the game, recipe, or craft, but we also have a history guide that shows you where the activity coordinates with Shakespeare's plays and with specific episodes of our show. It's great for educators and excellent for hands-on history enthusiasts who want to do more than just learn about Shakespeare's life. They'd like to experience a piece of it. If that sounds like you, then sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.